The courtroom was quiet, save for the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead and the occasional shuffle of papers. It wasn't a grand hall like the ones seen in movies, but rather a modest space with peeling paint on the walls and rows of worn wooden benches. The air felt heavy, as though it carried the weight of countless stories, some hopeful, others tragic. Today, however, tension crackled like electricity. At the center of it all sat Judge Harold Whittaker, a man whose stern face rarely softened. His reputation preceded him. He was known for his no-nonsense attitude and harsh sentences, especially toward those from marginalized communities. Some whispered that he seemed to view justice not as fairness, but as punishment. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the room with an unreadable expression. Behind him hung an old clock, its ticking echoing loudly in the silence. Standing before him was Evelyn Carter, a young black woman whose presence commanded attention despite her calm demeanor. She wore a simple blouse and skirt, her hair neatly tied back. Her hands were clasped tightly together, betraying just a hint of nervousness. But her eyes told another story. They were steady, unwavering, almost defiant. To anyone watching, she didn't look like someone guilty of a crime. Yet here she was, accused of vandalism after allegedly spray-painting political slogans on a government building during a protest. Evelyn's attorney stood beside her, arguing passionately that this wasn't an act of destruction, but a form of free speech, a cry for justice against systemic issues plaguing their community. "Your Honor," the lawyer said, his voice firm yet respectful, "my client is not a criminal. She is an activist standing up for what she believes is right." But the prosecutor countered sharply, painting Evelyn as reckless and dangerous. "Free speech does not mean breaking the law," he argued, pointing out the cost of repairing the damaged property. "This isn't about politics, it's about accountability." Judge Whittaker listened without flinching, his face a mask of indifference. When Evelyn tried to speak, explaining why she had joined the protest and how deeply personal the issue was for her, the judge interrupted brusquely. "Enough," he snapped, cutting her off mid-sentence. "This court doesn't need a lecture on your beliefs." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. Some attendees exchanged knowing glances, while others shook their heads in disapproval. They'd seen this play out before, minority defendants treated differently, their voices silenced or dismissed. One elderly woman sitting near the front leaned forward slightly, studying Evelyn with sympathy. "She doesn't deserve this," she muttered under her breath to her companion. Despite the mounting tension, Evelyn remained composed. She took a deep breath, refusing to let frustration show. Instead, she glanced around the room, meeting the eyes of those who supported her. There was strength in their solidarity, even if it couldn't sway the outcome today. As the proceedings continued, Judge Whittaker scribbled notes on a legal pad, his pen moving swiftly across the page. Every so often, he would glance up at Evelyn, his gaze cold and calculating. It was clear he had already formed his opinion. And when he finally leaned back in his chair, preparing to deliver his verdict, the entire room seemed to hold its collective breath. What would happen next? No one could be sure, but everyone knew the stakes were high. The moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. Judge Harold Whittaker leaned forward, his gavel resting heavily in his hand. The courtroom fell silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every breath feel loud. All eyes were on him as he prepared to deliver his verdict. Evelyn stood motionless, her hands clasped together, her face calm, but her heart racing. She had done nothing more than speak out against injustice, yet here she was, facing consequences far greater than she ever imagined. Judge Whittaker cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Miss Carter," he began, his tone sharp and unyielding, "this court does not tolerate acts of vandalism, regardless of the so-called message behind them." He paused, glancing down at his notes before continuing. "You chose to break the law, and you must face the consequences." Then came the words that sent shockwaves through the room. 6 months in jail, and a hefty fine. Gasps erupted from the gallery, followed by murmurs of disbelief. Even seasoned attorneys exchanged wide-eyed looks, their pens frozen mid-note. A sentence this severe for a nonviolent offense was unheard of, especially given the circumstances. To many, it felt less like justice and more like punishment designed to send a chilling message. Evelyn's attorney immediately rose to his feet, protesting the decision. "Your Honor, this is excessive. My client has no prior record, and her actions—" "Enough," Judge Whittaker barked, slamming his gavel down with a resounding crack. "This court will not entertain further arguments. The sentence stands." As bailiffs moved to escort Evelyn away, she turned back briefly to look at the judge. There was no anger in her eyes, no bitterness, only sadness. It was a look that lingered, piercing through the hardened exterior Judge Whittaker prided himself on. For a split second, he hesitated, unsure why her gaze unsettled him so deeply. But just as quickly, he pushed the feeling aside, dismissing it as irrelevant. After all, he told himself, the law was the law, and emotions had no place in his courtroom. The gallery buzzed with outrage as Evelyn was led out. Some people shook their heads in disbelief, while others whispered angrily about how unfair the system was. One man near the front muttered, "This isn't justice, it's revenge." An elderly woman dabbed at her eyes, visibly shaken by what she'd witnessed. Even the court reporter seemed uneasy, her fingers hovering over the keys as though reluctant to document the scene unfolding before her. Outside the courtroom, news of the verdict spread rapidly. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse within hours, holding signs that read "Justice for Evelyn" and "Free speech isn't a crime." Social media exploded with reactions, hashtags trending nationwide, as people shared Evelyn's story. Supporters described her as a symbol of resilience, someone willing to risk everything to fight for equality. Critics, however, pointed to the incident as yet another example of systemic bias, a reminder that the scales of justice weren't balanced equally for everyone. Back inside the courtroom, Judge Whittaker tried to focus on the next case, but something gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the image of Evelyn turning to look at him one last time before being taken away. Her expression haunted him, not because it was accusatory or angry, but because it was filled with quiet disappointment. It was as if she saw right through him, past the robes and the gavel, to the flawed human beneath. For years, Judge Whittaker had convinced himself that his rulings were impartial, guided solely by the letter of the law. But now doubt crept into his mind like an unwelcome guest. Had he truly acted fairly, or had his own biases clouded his judgment? These questions lingered uncomfortably, refusing to be ignored. Later that evening, as he sat alone in his chambers reviewing case files, Judge Whittaker found himself staring blankly at the wall. His usual confidence wavered, replaced by an unfamiliar sense of unease. What if he'd made a mistake? And if so, what did that mean for the countless other lives he'd impacted with similar decisions? He didn't have answers, only questions. Questions that would haunt him long after the day's proceedings ended. Judge Harold Whittaker couldn't escape the weight of what he'd learned. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind replayed every detail of Evelyn's case. The way he'd interrupted her, dismissed her explanations, and handed down a sentence that now seemed impossibly harsh. Sleep eluded him, replaced by a restless tide of thoughts. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to reflect deeply, not just on this one case, but on the countless others where he might have acted too quickly, too harshly, or with blind prejudice. The next morning, he arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual, carrying the packet of documents about Evelyn and her mother. He sat alone in his chambers, rereading the materials and feeling the sting of his own actions. Ruth Carter's words resonated with him, particularly one line from her memoir. "Justice isn't about punishment, it's about understanding." Those words struck a chord, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself. Was he truly upholding justice, or was he perpetuating the same inequalities he claimed to stand against? Determined to learn more, Judge Whittaker began researching Evelyn's background beyond the information provided in the letter. He discovered articles about her work as a community organizer, how she'd helped establish programs for underprivileged youth, spoken out against police brutality, and advocated for affordable housing in underserved neighborhoods. He read testimonials from people whose lives she touched, each story painting a clearer picture of a woman driven by compassion and conviction. But it wasn't just Evelyn's accomplishments that moved him. It was the realization of how little effort he'd made to understand her during the trial. Instead of listening, he had judged her based on stereotypes and assumptions. The memory of her calm demeanor during sentencing haunted him now. She hadn't fought back or lashed out. She had simply accepted his ruling with grace, even though it was unjust. It was a level of dignity he realized he didn't deserve. Haunted by guilt, Judge Whittaker decided to take an unprecedented step. He requested a private meeting with Evelyn while she awaited transfer to prison. At first, her attorney was skeptical, unsure of the judge's intentions, but Evelyn agreed, curious to hear what he had to say. When they finally met in a small conference room at the detention center, the atmosphere was tense but charged with possibility. Evelyn walked in wearing the same quiet strength that had defined her in court. Her eyes met Judge Whittaker's, searching for sincerity. For a moment, neither spoke. Finally, the judge broke the silence. "Ms. Carter," he began, his voice uncharacteristically soft. "I owe you an apology." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "An apology?" she asked calmly. "Yes," he admitted, lowering his gaze for a moment before looking back at her. "I sentenced you without fully understanding who you are or why you did what you did. I let my biases cloud my judgment, and for that, I am deeply sorry." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Evelyn studied him carefully, as if trying to gauge whether his remorse was genuine. After a long pause, she nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying that," she said, "but apologies aren't enough. What matters is what you do moving forward." Her response caught him off guard, not because it was harsh, but because it was true. She wasn't interested in empty gestures. She wanted accountability. Encouraged by her honesty, Judge Whittaker pressed further. "Tell me more about your work," he said earnestly. "Help me understand what drives you." For the next hour, Evelyn shared her journey, growing up inspired by her mother's activism, witnessing firsthand the injustices faced by marginalized communities, and dedicating her life to creating change. She spoke passionately about the importance of addressing systemic issues rather than punishing individuals for speaking out. Judge Whittaker listened intently, realizing how narrow his perspective had been. By the end of their conversation, something profound had shifted within him. Evelyn's resilience and wisdom challenged him to rethink everything he believed about justice. As they parted ways, he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't go back to being the man he once was. This meeting wasn't just a reckoning. It was the beginning of a transformation. Judge Harold Whittaker was no stranger to controversy. Over the years, his name had become synonymous with strict rulings and a rigid interpretation of the law. Many accused him of being harsher on defendants who didn't look like him, those from minority communities, especially black individuals. While some dismissed these claims as mere gossip, others pointed to patterns in his decisions: longer sentences, less leniency, and little patience for explanations or context when it came to marginalized groups. Today was no different. As Evelyn Carter stood before him, Judge Whittaker's mind was already made up. To him, she fit a familiar mold: a protester, an agitator, someone challenging authority under the guise of activism. He didn't see her as a person with a story, dreams, or struggles. Instead, he saw her actions as reckless defiance that needed to be punished swiftly and severely. When Evelyn tried to explain herself during the trial, Judge Whittaker interrupted without hesitation. "You think defacing public property is justified?" he asked sharply, his tone dripping with disdain. His words cut through the room like a knife, silencing Evelyn mid-sentence. For a moment, she faltered, taken aback by his abruptness. But then she straightened her posture, meeting his gaze with quiet determination. She wasn't going to let his dismissiveness break her spirit. The gallery watched intently. Their reactions varied. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others exchanged glances filled with frustration. A young man sitting near the back clenched his fists tightly, muttering something under his breath about how unfair this all felt. An older woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, visibly moved by Evelyn's composure despite the odds stacked against her. Even Evelyn's attorney seemed to brace himself, knowing full well how difficult it was to sway Judge Whittaker once he'd formed an opinion. What made matters worse was that Judge Whittaker didn't seem interested in hearing the full picture. When Evelyn's lawyer presented evidence showing that her actions were part of a peaceful protest gone wrong, the judge barely glanced at the documents. Instead, he focused solely on the damage done to the building, dismissing any mention of the message behind the graffiti. "This isn't about your cause," he said firmly. "It's about breaking the law." His bias wasn't subtle. It lingered in the way he leaned forward slightly whenever Evelyn spoke, as though ready to pounce on any misstep. It showed in the condescending tone he used when addressing her and in the way he nodded approvingly at the prosecutor's arguments, but rarely acknowledged anything from the defense. For Evelyn, it was exhausting. Each word out of his mouth felt like another brick added to the wall between them, a barrier built not just by his beliefs, but also by years of ingrained prejudice. Yet, amidst all of this, there was something unsettling about Evelyn's presence that even Judge Whittaker couldn't ignore. It wasn't anger or aggression, it was resilience. Despite his attempts to intimidate her, she remained calm, composed, and unshaken. Her voice carried a quiet strength that resonated with those listening, even if Judge Whittaker refused to acknowledge it. Every time she spoke, every time she looked directly at him, it was as though she was silently challenging him to see her humanity. As the session dragged on, Judge Whittaker found himself growing increasingly irritated, not because Evelyn was difficult, but because she wasn't reacting the way he expected. Protesters, activists, defendants, they were supposed to crumble under pressure, to show fear or desperation. But Evelyn did none of that. Instead, she stood tall, embodying dignity even in the face of injustice. And though he wouldn't admit it, her unwavering resolve unsettled him more than he cared to admit. By the time the proceedings concluded, the tension in the room was palpable. Judge Whittaker's pen hovered over his notepad as he jotted down final notes, his expression unreadable. The decision was clear in his mind. He would make an example of Evelyn, sending a message to anyone else who dared challenge the system. But deep down, buried beneath layers of arrogance and prejudice, a tiny seed of doubt began to sprout. Who exactly was this woman standing before him? And why did her quiet courage feel so undeniable? Weeks passed after Evelyn's sentencing, and life in the courthouse continued as usual, or so it seemed. Judge Harold Whittaker carried on with his duties, presiding over cases with the same stern demeanor that had defined his career for decades. But beneath his composed exterior, something was different. The memory of Evelyn's calm yet piercing gaze lingered in his mind like a shadow he couldn't shake. It wasn't just her expression. It was the weight of her silence, the way she'd stood tall despite the injustice dealt to her. For reasons he couldn't fully explain, she stayed with him. One morning, as Judge Whittaker sifted through a pile of mail on his desk, an envelope caught his attention. It was plain, unassuming, but addressed directly to him in neat handwriting. Intrigued, he opened it carefully. Inside was a letter from Evelyn's attorney, accompanied by several documents and photographs. As he began reading, his brow furrowed deeper with each line. The letter revealed something extraordinary. Evelyn Carter wasn't just any defendant. She was the daughter of Ruth Carter, a legendary civil rights icon whose name resonated across generations. Ruth had dedicated her life to fighting racial inequality, inspiring countless activists, including some who now held influential positions within the legal system. Her memoirs, excerpts of which were included in the packet, spoke passionately about justice, equality, and the importance of standing up against oppression. Judge Whittaker paused, staring at one of the photographs attached to the letter. It showed a young Evelyn standing beside her mother at a rally, both holding signs that read "Equality Now." Their smiles radiated hope and determination, a stark contrast to the cold walls of his courtroom. He felt a pang of discomfort as he realized how little he knew about the woman he'd sentenced. To him, she had simply been another protester, a faceless figure challenging authority. But now, she had a story, a legacy, a purpose far bigger than he'd ever considered. The documents also highlighted Evelyn's own achievements as a community organizer. She had spent years working tirelessly to address systemic racism, mentor young activists, and advocate for marginalized voices. Letters of support poured in from local leaders, educators, and even former clients whose lives she touched. One testimonial described her as a beacon of hope in our darkest times, while another called her efforts a continuation of her mother's invaluable work. As Judge Whittaker flipped through the pages, guilt began to creep into his thoughts. How could he have missed this? How could he have dismissed her so easily, reducing her to a single act without considering the person behind it? The evidence painted a picture of someone who embodied courage and resilience, qualities he claimed to admire in others, but had failed to recognize in Evelyn. By the time he reached the final page, his hands trembled slightly. There was no accusation in the letter, no demand for retribution. Instead, it ended with a simple request. We ask that you take a moment to reflect on the broader implications of your decision and consider whether true justice has been served. For hours, Judge Whittaker sat alone in his chambers, the letter spread out before him. His mind raced with conflicting emotions, shame, regret, and a growing sense of responsibility. He thought about Ruth Carter's legacy and wondered if he'd tarnished it by punishing her daughter so harshly. He thought about Evelyn's quiet strength and how she'd faced his judgment without bitterness or anger. Most of all, he thought about himself, about the kind of man he wanted to be versus the reputation he'd built over the years. That night, unable to sleep, he found himself pacing his study. The clock ticked loudly, mocking his restlessness. He picked up the photograph of Evelyn and her mother again, studying their faces closely. They looked so full of life, so committed to making the world better. Could he say the same about himself? Or had he allowed his biases to blind him, turning his courtroom into a place where fairness was overshadowed by prejudice? A heavy sigh escaped his lips as he placed the photo back on the table. For the first time in years, Judge Whittaker questioned not only his actions, but also the very foundation of his beliefs. Who was he serving with his rulings? The law or his own flawed perceptions? And more importantly, was it too late to change? The legacy of Judge Harold Whittaker and Evelyn Carter became a story told not just in courtrooms or activist circles, but in classrooms, community centers, and even family dinner tables. It was a tale of accountability, transformation, and the power of empathy. A reminder that no one is beyond redemption if they're willing to confront their mistakes. Together, their journey inspired generations to challenge their own biases and strive for a fairer world. Judge Whittaker's retirement years were filled with purpose. While some former judges spent their days golfing or traveling, he chose a different path. He wrote a memoir titled Beyond the Gavel, detailing his evolution from a rigid enforcer of laws to someone who understood the deeper meaning of justice. The book wasn't an attempt to polish his image. Instead, it was raw and honest, filled with reflections on his missteps and the lessons he learned. One chapter, titled The Day I Was Wrong, focused entirely on Evelyn's case and how it had forced him to reevaluate everything he thought he knew about fairness. Readers connected deeply with his words. Teachers used excerpts from the memoir in high school civics classes, sparking discussions about bias and systemic inequality. Law schools invited him to speak at graduation ceremonies, where students eagerly asked questions about navigating ethical dilemmas in their careers. Though some critics still questioned whether his changes came too late, most agreed that his willingness to grow made him a role model for anyone seeking to do better. Evelyn, meanwhile, continued to lead with passion and purpose. Her activism evolved into something larger than herself. She founded an organization called Voices Unsilenced, dedicated to amplifying marginalized voices and advocating for criminal justice reform. The group provided legal aid to underprivileged communities, organized workshops on civic engagement, and partnered with lawmakers to draft policies addressing systemic racism. Evelyn often credited Judge Whittaker's apology as a catalyst for her renewed determination. "He taught me that change can come from unlikely places," she said during one speech. "And that gives me hope." Their bond remained strong over the years. They occasionally collaborated on projects aimed at educating people about bias and promoting restorative justice. During one event, a young woman approached them after their panel discussion, tears streaming down her face. "Your story saved me," she confessed. "I almost gave up on believing the system could change, but hearing how you two work together reminded me that we all have the power to make a difference." Moments like these reinforced why their partnership mattered, not just for themselves, but for everyone watching. As time went on, their story took on a life of its own. Documentaries explored their unlikely alliance, highlighting how Evelyn's resilience had challenged Judge Whittaker to confront his prejudices. Schools named scholarships after Ruth Carter, honoring her legacy, while also celebrating the work Evelyn and Judge Whittaker had done to carry it forward. Even Hollywood took notice, producing a film based on their journey. Though fictionalized, the movie captured the essence of their story, how two people from vastly different worlds found common ground and sparked meaningful change. In their later years, both Judge Whittaker and Evelyn reflected on the impact they'd made. Sitting on a park bench one sunny afternoon, they laughed about how far they'd come since their tense first meeting. "Do you think we'll ever stop surprising people?" Evelyn teased, gesturing toward a group of teenagers nearby who recognized them and excitedly whispered to each other. "I hope not," Judge Whittaker replied with a chuckle. "If we've learned anything, it's that real change happens when people stay open to being surprised and to surprising themselves." Their shared laughter echoed through the park, a testament to the enduring friendship born out of adversity. Though neither claimed perfection, they were human after all. They stood as proof that growth and reconciliation are possible, even in the face of deep divides. Ultimately, their legacy was simple yet profound. Justice begins with seeing others as equals, flaws and all. And sometimes, all it takes is one brave step toward understanding to ignite a ripple effect of change. Whether through Evelyn's tireless advocacy or Judge Whittaker's humbling transformation, their story reminded the world that true justice isn't handed down. It's built together, brick by brick, heart by heart. The meeting with Evelyn left an indelible mark on Judge Harold Whittaker. It wasn't just her words that resonated with him. It was the way she carried herself, the quiet conviction in her voice, and the undeniable truth behind her perspective. For days after their conversation, he found himself replaying snippets of what she'd said. "Justice isn't about punishment, it's about understanding." Those words echoed in his mind, forcing him to confront the flaws in his own approach to the law. Determined to make amends, not just for Evelyn, but for others who might have been wronged by his biases, Judge Whittaker began taking concrete steps toward change. He started small, attending workshops on implicit bias and systemic racism. At first, he felt out of place among the attendees, many of whom were younger activists or social workers. But as he listened to their stories and insights, he realized how much he had to learn. One session, led by a former public defender turned advocate, particularly struck him. The speaker emphasized the importance of empathy in the courtroom, urging judges to see defendants not as cases or statistics, but as human beings with lives, struggles, and potential. Inspired, Judge Whittaker decided to implement changes in his own courtroom. He invited guest speakers to educate court staff about racial equity and fair sentencing practices. Some colleagues rolled their eyes at his newfound enthusiasm, whispering sarcastic comments like, "What's next? Hugs instead of handcuffs." But Judge Whittaker didn't let their skepticism deter him. If anything, it fueled his resolve to prove them wrong. He also began reviewing past cases, poring over files late into the night to identify instances where his rulings might have been influenced by bias. It was a humbling process, one that forced him to face uncomfortable truths about his career. In several cases, he discovered evidence of disproportionately harsh sentences handed down to minority defendants. Though reversing those decisions was beyond his power now, he made sure to document his findings and share them with higher courts in hopes of prompting reviews. Meanwhile, Evelyn's situation took a turn for the better. Thanks in part to Judge Whittaker's acknowledgement of his error, her attorney successfully filed an appeal. The appellate court overturned her sentence, citing procedural errors and excessive punishment. When Evelyn walked out of the detention center, free once again, she was greeted by cheering supporters holding signs that read "Justice prevails" and "Evelyn inspires us all." But freedom didn't mean Evelyn planned to rest. If anything, her ordeal only strengthened her commitment to activism. She resumed her work with renewed energy, organizing rallies, speaking at community events, and collaborating with organizations pushing for criminal justice reform. Her story became a rallying cry for change, inspiring people across the country to demand fairness and accountability within the legal system. Word of Judge Whittaker's transformation spread quickly, earning both praise and criticism. Supporters hailed him as proof that even deeply ingrained biases could be unlearned, while skeptics accused him of seeking redemption too little, too late. Yet, regardless of the mixed reactions, there was no denying the impact of his efforts. His courtroom became known not just for its strict adherence to the law, but for its growing emphasis on fairness and humanity. One day, during a particularly challenging case involving a young man charged with trespassing, Judge Whittaker surprised everyone, including himself, by asking thoughtful questions about the defendant's circumstances. Instead of rushing to judgment, he listened carefully to the defense attorney's arguments and considered alternative sentencing options. When he ultimately ruled in favor of probation coupled with counseling, the gallery erupted in applause. It was a small victory, but one that symbolized progress. As months passed, Judge Whittaker continued to evolve. He partnered with local advocacy groups to create programs aimed at reducing recidivism and addressing root causes of crime. He even joined a mentorship initiative, working directly with at-risk youth to steer them away from paths that might lead to trouble. Each step forward felt like shedding another layer of the hardened exterior he'd worn for so long. Looking back, Judge Whittaker knew he couldn't undo the mistakes of his past. But every action he took now, from listening more intently to ruling more compassionately, was a testament to how far he'd come. And though he still had much to learn, he finally understood something Evelyn had tried to teach him. True justice begins not with gavels or laws, but with hearts willing to change. Years passed, and the name Judge Harold Whittaker began to carry a new meaning. Once known for his rigid adherence to punishment and his controversial rulings, he was now recognized as someone who had dared to confront his flaws and transform himself, and, in turn, his courtroom. His journey wasn't easy. It required humility, courage, and an unwavering willingness to listen. But those qualities became the foundation of his legacy. When Judge Whittaker finally announced his retirement, the courthouse buzzed with mixed emotions. Some were sad to see him go, while others marveled at how far he'd come since that fateful day when Evelyn Carter stood before him. During his farewell speech, he didn't shy away from addressing his past mistakes. Standing behind the same bench where he'd once handed down harsh sentences, he spoke candidly about the moment he realized he'd been wrong. "I used to believe justice was black and white," he admitted, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I thought my job was to enforce the law without question or hesitation. But I've learned that true justice is far more complex than that. It's about fairness, understanding, and recognizing the humanity in every person who walks through these doors." The audience erupted into applause, many rising to their feet. Among them was Evelyn, who attended the ceremony not out of obligation, but because she genuinely respected the man Judge Whittaker had become. When their eyes met across the room, They shared a silent acknowledgement, a mutual understanding of how far they'd both come since their first encounter. In the years following his retirement, Judge Whittaker dedicated himself to mentoring young lawyers and judges. He traveled across the country, giving lectures on bias, empathy, and the importance of reforming outdated systems. His talks weren't just theoretical, they were deeply personal, filled with stories of his own missteps and the lessons he'd learned along the way. Audiences listened intently, moved by his honesty and inspired by his transformation. Meanwhile, Evelyn continued to make waves as a leader in her community. Her activism expanded beyond local efforts, gaining national attention as she partnered with organizations advocating for criminal justice reform. She often credited Judge Whittaker's apology and subsequent actions as a turning point, not just for herself, but for the broader movement. "Change starts with accountability," she said during one interview. And Judge Whittaker showed us that even those in positions of power can admit when they're wrong and work to do better. Their paths occasionally crossed over the years, usually at events focused on equity and justice. Each time, their interactions carried a sense of mutual respect and shared purpose. Evelyn never hesitated to remind people of Judge Whittaker's evolution, using his story as proof that no one is beyond redemption if they're willing to confront their biases. For his part, Judge Whittaker frequently praised Evelyn's resilience and grace, calling her a force of nature whose strength had changed the course of his life. Together, their unlikely partnership sparked meaningful conversations about race, bias, and systemic inequality. Schools began teaching their story as an example of accountability and growth. Documentaries were made, books were written, and panels were held, all centered around the idea that progress requires vulnerability and action. As Judge Whittaker grew older, he often reflected on his career with a mix of pride and humility. He knew he hadn't fixed everything. No single person could, but he took solace in knowing he'd played a role in moving the needle forward. One evening, sitting in his study surrounded by photographs and mementos from his years on the bench, he picked up a framed picture of Evelyn standing beside her mother at a rally. Smiling faintly, he whispered, "Thank you." Evelyn, too, looked back on their journey with gratitude. Though their initial meeting had been fraught with tension, it had ultimately led to something transformative, not just for them individually, but for countless others inspired by their story. As she stood before crowds of supporters, urging them to keep fighting for justice, she often ended her speeches with a simple yet powerful reminder. Change begins when we choose to see each other as human beings first. And sometimes, all it takes is one moment of honesty to set that change in motion. Through their separate but intertwined journeys, Judge Whittaker and Evelyn Carter proved that redemption and reconciliation are possible, even in the most unexpected places. Their story served as a beacon of hope, reminding everyone that justice isn't just about laws or verdicts. It's about hearts and minds coming together to create a better future.